Howdy, y'all. Today we're going to be talking about argument evaluation and argument types, along with some terminology that goes along with these types. This is meant to sort of go along with your reading from Chapter 3. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the difference between deductive arguments and inductive arguments and how that sort of plays a role in argument evaluation. Okay, so to start, we're going to be talking about the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. And this differentiation comes from a division that arises from sort of two questions that we ask about the arguments in terms of their evaluation. So when we evaluate an argument, just sort of very simply put, when we have a conclusion and we have at least one premise that's being sort of offered in support of that conclusion, we want to know sort of two things. So the first thing we want to know is pretty straightforward. We just want to know, is that premise true, or premises, depending, I don't know how many you have. So the premises need to be true. It's a necessary condition for this thing to work. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time with that, at least in this chapter, but it is important. But the second thing, and this is the thing that we're going to spend most of our time with, is do the premises prove or at least sort of adequately support the conclusion? So this is more of a question about sort of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Sort of what sort of inference are we drawing, and what is sort of the level of support or proof that the premises are providing. So a deductive argument, so gets to our distinction between deductive and inductive. A deductive argument is just one that intends for the premises to prove a conclusion. And we're going to get into a little bit more about sort of what that means, but essentially a deductive argument is one that intends to be valid. So arguments with premises that prove a conclusion are called valid arguments. And that is an answer to sort of number two. So if it succeeds in proving the conclusion, then it's valid. And then if it also has premises that are true, right, that's the question, that's the first question, then the argument is said to be sound. So a sound argument is just one that is valid and has true premises. And we'll be talking about that more here as we sort of go along, but that is just some sort of terminology. So validity is about the premises sort of supporting the conclusion. Soundness is just validity plus true premises. And that's for deductive arguments. Inductive arguments, the logic is a little bit different. The number two answer is not in terms of sort of proof, but in terms of sort of support. So an inductive argument is such that the premises are intended to support the conclusion and not necessarily prove. And again, we'll get into what that means here in a little bit. But we have a little bit different sort of terminology for that. Arguments that do have premises that provide such support we call strong arguments. And then similarly to soundness, if an argument is strong and it has true premises, then we say that the argument is cogent. All right, so let's dive a little bit more deeper into this idea of deduction and validity and soundness. So remember that a deductive argument is one that intends to be valid. And a valid argument is such, so this is the proof concept. A valid argument is such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Or must be true. So this is this idea that the proof is a very sort of strong relationship, that if you're proving something and the premises are valid, then that means that the conclusion is necessitated. So the conclusion has to be true if the premises are true. So this is a little bit different with inductive arguments, and we'll talk about that here a little bit later. But for now, just bear in mind that validity is a feature of necessitation, that the conclusion has to be true if the premises are true. Now, bear in mind that the premises aren't necessarily true for a valid argument. So this just says that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's what a valid argument is. Another way to kind of define a valid argument is to say that a valid argument is such that it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. So it's basically the same kind of idea behind sort of necessitation, is that there's just no way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false. So again, that just feeds back to the first definition, that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So an invalid argument is just any argument that isn't valid, and I bring this up here just to see what the difference is. An invalid argument then is such that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So an invalid argument is such that even if your premises are true, it's still possible that the conclusion is false. So we'll be looking into that in more detail as we go along. So again, just one more time to kind of reiterate that a valid argument can have false premises. Remember, there's two questions here. One is, are the premises true? And two is the argument valid? So it can be valid, but at the same time have false premises. And then back to soundness. Sound arguments are the ones that are valid and have true premises. So they got to have both, two necessary conditions for soundness. And then finally, validity is typically a feature of the logical structure or pattern of the argument. And so it's not necessarily sort of about the content of the sentences, but rather the type of sentences that you're dealing with, or the logical features of those sentences. And so this is going to be kind of the tricky bit about deductive arguments, and it's also the reason why at the end of chapter 3, or at least your reading of chapter 3, you look at some patterns, some valid patterns, and a couple of invalid patterns. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that here for a minute. Okay, so as I mentioned, validity is sort of a feature of the logical structure or the pattern of the argument, and I just want to talk a little bit here about patterns before sort of moving on. So we're just going to take a look at two different patterns of arguments. So this doesn't exhaust all of the valid or invalid arguments, and again, from your reading, you'll see that there are more valid patterns than the one that is shown here. But I'm just using these two patterns as an example. So we have an example of a valid argument that follows a valid pattern, and then an example of an invalid argument that follows an invalid pattern. So remember, if it's valid, then the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And if it's invalid, then even if the premises are true, it's still possible that the conclusion is false. So let's start with the valid argument here. So in English, I have all dogs know tricks is a premise. Another premise is that Freddie is a dog, and the conclusion is that Freddie knows tricks. So we're not going to worry about whether or not these premises are true. We're just going to assume that they are true, and just sort of think about sort of just the pattern of this argument. So if you look to the right of this Freddie argument, you see that sort of the pattern that this follows is something along the lines of all A's are B's, where dogs is A's and B's are things that know tricks. And then Freddy here is just has been replaced with an X. So Freddy is an A, therefore Freddy is a B. So it turns out, and in chapter 7, we're going to be talking about arguments that look like this, but it turns out that anything that follows this pattern is valid. As long as you replace things for A's and B's and X's such that your premises end up being true, your conclusion is always going to be true. So this is one of those things where, let me just kind of write it out here a little bit. So if it turns out that your premises are true, your conclusion is always going to be true. Right? It's impossible for both of these premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So this is just something that can't happen. And this goes back to the definition that I gave in the previous slide. So true premises, false conclusion is something that can't happen with this pattern. But if you look down below with this invalid argument, this invalid argument or first of all, it's an argument that's invalid, but it's invalid because it follows a pattern where true premises and a false conclusion is possible. So down here, it's possible for both of these premises to be true, but still have sort of a false conclusion. So in English, we have all dogs know tricks. We have Lulu knows tricks, therefore sort of Lulu is a dog. So again, assuming that those premises are true, it's possible that the conclusion is still false. So if you think about Lulu here, so it could be the case that Lulu knows tricks, but it may very well be that Lulu is a different kind of animal that knows tricks, right? So maybe Lulu is a seal, right, or a horse or something. I don't know, some other kind of animal that knows tricks. And so again, it's possible that all dogs know tricks. It's possible that all A's are B's. And it's possible that Lulu knows tricks, right? It's possible that X is a B, but at the same time, it doesn't follow that X is an A, right? It's possible that this conclusion is still false, even though the premises are true. So an invalid argument is such that it has this pattern where the premises could be true, but you could still have a false conclusion. So valid arguments tend to have a pattern. Well, again, we're usually talking about patterns. So valid arguments have a pattern where true premises and a false conclusion is impossible. Invalid arguments are such that true premises and a false conclusion are possible. And in chapters 6 and 7, we'll be talking about this in a lot more detail. Okay, so again, just remember that any argument that follows a valid pattern is still valid, even if the premises turn out to be false. So if Freddy isn't a dog, right, or if it's not the case that all dogs know tricks, that just means that the premises are false. It doesn't change the pattern of the argument. So the pattern is still valid, even if the premises are false. Okay, so to end our discussion of deduction, we're just going to talk about how these arguments can kind of play out with our two questions. So remember, the two questions for deductive arguments are going to be, are the premises true? And do the premises prove the conclusion? Is the argument valid or not? So with these, two questions, you get sort of 4 possible answers. So on one hand, you got, you can have an argument that has true premises or doesn't, right? And that just means it has one or more false premises. And then you have an argument that either proves the conclusion or doesn't, which means it's an argument that follows a valid pattern, or one that follows an invalid pattern. So given that, you got sort of four possibilities, and what you're shooting for is one that has both, right? The one that has true premises and is valid. So that's a sound argument. So in the top left here, in our little chart, we have valid with true premises. To the right of that is an argument with true premises but is invalid. And on the bottom row, we've got on the left an argument that has one or more false premises that follows a valid pattern. And then to the right of that, an argument that is neither, right? It neither has all true premises nor is it valid. So it has at least one false premise and also follows an invalid pattern. So I just want to briefly go through these examples before moving on to induction. So we'll start with the good one here. So the top left, the sound argument. All cats are mammals, that's true. Tigers are cats, that's true. And from those two premises, just the pattern of this argument is such that given those true premises, then it must be the case that tigers are mammals. So it's both the case that the argument is valid and the argument has true premises, so the argument is sound. Now to the right is an argument with true premises, but it doesn't follow a valid pattern. So what that means is even if the premises are both true, it's going to be possible that the conclusion is still false, and that's not good. So it's true that all cats are mammals, it's true that all dogs are mammals, but it doesn't necessarily follow from that dogs are cats. So in fact, I hope you know that dogs are not cats. So it should be obvious here that even though the premises are true, the conclusion could still be false, and so it's invalid. Where things can get a little bit more tricky is when you have an argument with sort of false premises, right? It's hard to imagine an argument with false premises that we say is valid, but nevertheless, bottom left is a valid argument. It's a valid pattern that just happens to have false premises. If it had true premises, then the conclusion would have to be true, but in this case, it doesn't have true premises, right? And the first premise here is I hope clearly false, that some cats are reptiles. That's not true. No cats are reptiles. And it's also the case that no cats have fur is false. That no cats have, that the opposite of no cats have fur is that some cats have fur. And we know that some cats have fur. So both of those premises are false, but if they were true, it would have to be true that some reptiles don't have fur. That the truth of those premises, if they were true, would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So it's valid, but it has one or more false premises. All right, so moving on, we have bottom right, which nothing is going right here, so we have false premises and an invalid pattern, so everything is just sort of a mess here. So no cats are reptiles, that's false. Oh wait, no, actually that one's true, but it's false that no cats have fur. And from that argument, you don't even have a guarantee that all reptiles have fur. So none of this really works. So the pattern is such that even if the premises were true, the conclusion could still be false. And then furthermore, the premises aren't even true. So bottom right is just a failure in all counts. Okay, so that pretty much kind of does it for deduction. As I said, these are going to be things, especially with sort of talking about patterns and knowing which patterns are actually valid and invalid. That's going to be something we take up in more detail in chapters 6 and 7. But for now, I guess just kind of trust me that the left column, the pattern that the left column is following, are valid patterns, and that the patterns on the right column are invalid patterns. Okay, so let's move on to inductive arguments, and inductive arguments are things that have, are arguments where the intention is not to prove that the conclusion is true, but rather for the premises to support the conclusion. And so arguments that do that, we call those strong arguments. So instead of valid, we say strong. And bear in mind that strong arguments are not valid. And the reason why that's the case is because the strong argument's about probability. A strong argument is such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is probably true. So not a guarantee that it's true, just probably true. And all we mean by that, if you want to get really specific, is that it's greater than 50% chance. So it's better than guessing. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion is probably true. That's what it means to be a strong argument. And that's going to be quite a range, right? Because that's anything from 51% all the way up to close to 100%. And a strong argument, bear in mind that there's no guarantee of truth here. So that means they're not valid, right? Valid arguments are such where the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So instead of that sort of guarantee, we're talking about the premises making something likely to be true. So that's why I think the language in the chapter is about sort of support instead of proof. So just like with validity, we have the opposite, which is invalidity. With strength, we have the opposite, which is weakness. So a weak argument is just one where the premises fail to make the conclusion even likely to be true. So you have sort of less or equal than sort of 50% chance of being right given the truth of the premises. And again, a strong argument can have false premises. So this is just, when we talk about strength here, we're just talking about that second question, whether or not the premises prove or provide support for the conclusion. So it could have a false premise. So what we're shooting for is one that is both strong and has true premises. So a cogent argument is the name of an argument that is both strong and has true premises. Now let's kind of end with this. Unlike validity, strength is not a feature of the pattern of the argument. So you can have arguments that have the same sort of pattern, but you could have one that's weak and the other that is strong, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about here for a second. All right, so inductive arguments come in different kind of flavors, and one flavor of inductive argument is something we call a statistical syllogism. So it has a pattern that's sort of fairly familiar, but we introduce some numbers into the situation, and it is those numbers that kind of tell you whether the argument is strong or weak. So it's not a feature of the pattern of the argument, it's actually a feature of the content of the argument. So look at the blue circle here in the middle. In the middle we have just sort of a basic sort of statistical syllogism pattern, where I have sort of y% of A are B, X is an A, therefore X is a B. So the line here at the bottom here is the conclusion. So if those two premises are true, well, you don't really know whether or not the conclusion is likely to be true until you know what that y is. You need to know kind of what that number is, or around what that number is, to get a sense of whether or not the conclusion is likely to be true. So again, this is the conclusion here at the bottom, that this y% is going to tell you whether or not that conclusion is likely to be true. So a strong argument is one where the conclusion is likely to be true. And so this argument is going to be strong as long as the y here is above 50%. So over here, here's 80% on the left in the green box. And you have 80% of A's or B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B. Then over here we say that this argument is strong because you have a sort of an 80% chance of being right. Right, and that's pretty good. So the conclusion is, if those two premises are true, the conclusion is probably true, right, with only a 20% chance of being wrong. So compare that to this orange box over here on the right. In the orange box, our y is now 10, right? So 10% of A's or B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. Now we have a situation where even if the premises are true, because of that 10%, there's only a 10% likelihood that the conclusion is true. And so under this condition, the argument is weak. So we have two arguments. They're both following the same basic pattern, but one is strong and one is weak. So bear in mind that this is different than from validity. With a valid argument, anything that follows a valid pattern is valid. And the only way to have an invalid argument is to have an invalid pattern. All right, so let's move on and talk about our, uh, our different concepts put together. So with inductive arguments, again, you're going to have a situation where you could have an argument with true premises or at least one false premise, and then you can have a situation where the argument is either strong or weak. So that sets up the same kind of 4x4 grid situation here. You can have a strong argument with true premises, but a strong argument with false premises. You can have a weak argument with true premises or a weak argument with false premises. And here I'm just using the same pattern over and over again. So I'm going to just do 4 different statistical syllogisms, 1 or 2 where the y is high enough to make the argument strong, and then 2 where the y is low enough to make it weak, right? So it's got to be above 50 to make it strong. So the left column, the arguments are strong. The right column, the arguments are weak. But the top row, you do that with true premises. So again, top left is what you're shooting for. You want a strong argument that has true premises. And so here, both premises are true. The Tim here refers to me. So everything here is true, at least most recent sort of CDC data says that 71% of Americans are overweight, and Tim is an American. It follows from that Tim is probably overweight. So this is strong. Remember that if those premises are true, the conclusion is probably true, and again, it does have true premises, so the argument is cogent. If you look over to the right, you have a weak argument, right? So here's something that is true, true premises, but even if the premises are true, the conclusion isn't very likely. So 2% of Americans believe that the Earth is flat. That is, again, the most recent polling data here is that about 2% of Americans believe that the Earth is flat. Tim is an American. Therefore, Tim believes that the Earth is flat. So true premises, but there's really just a 2% chance of being right here. So we say that the argument is weak. All right, bottom row, strong arguments with false premises. Again, kind of tricky to say that the argument is strong, but that it has a false premise. So here's a false premise. 90% of Democrats worship Satan. That's not true. Here's another false premise. Tim is a Democrat. And the conclusion is that Tim worships Satan. So even if both of those premises were true, excuse me, I should say, if those premises were true, it would be highly likely that the conclusion were true. In fact, there would only be a 10% chance of you being wrong if those premises were true. So this argument is strong, but unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you think about the possibility of me worshiping Satan, that the premises are both false. So you have false premises, but a strong argument. So again, kind of tricky to think that way, but that's what we would say. And then bottom right, we have the failure in all fronts here. So we're not saying anything true, and even if we were saying something true, we wouldn't have a high likelihood of being right. So we got 15% here. That's a pretty low number. 15% of Republicans believe in God. That's not true. It's much higher. Second premise is that Tim is Republican. That is also not true. Therefore, Tim believes in God. So even if both of those premises were true, and they're not, you would still only have a 15% chance of being right here, so you'd have an 85% chance of being wrong. So this is a pretty weak argument. So it's a weak argument, and it has false premises. Okay, so that's kind of it for at least the first few pages of chapter 3, just to kind of sort out the different terminology here, and I hope this helps a bit. But do bear in mind that this is kind of what we're going to be sort of doing as we sort of go forward, that once we kind of create an argument, we're going to think about, well, first of all, whether or not the premises are true. That's always going to be important. But the logical question of is the argument valid or invalid, or is it strong or weak? Those are the questions that are going to kind of follow us as we go through chapters 6 and 7, which is about validity. 8, 9, and 10 is about strong inductive inferences versus weak inductive arguments. But do just kind of remember that with the deductive things, with validity and invalidity, it's a question of the pattern of the argument. With strength and weaknesses, it's more about the content of the argument. So it's less about the pattern that something is following and more about what the premises are saying.